The snow had been falling for 6 hours, and Mara Voss had stopped caring about the cold, somewhere around hour 3. She moved through the tree line at a lean, her trekking poles punching clean holes in the crust with each step, breath fogging out in rhythmic white plumes that the wind tore apart before they got 2 feet from her face. The Kessler Range in winter wasn't a place that forgave distraction, and she didn't intend to offer it any. 1 foot, then the next. The ridge was 4 kilometers out and the daylight was burning. She'd been doing this for 11 years. Search and rescue, then wilderness survey, then 6 years of contract geological work for the Colonial Boundary Commission. 37 planets, 14 of them classified hostile. She had a scar along her left jawline from a rock slide on Durazafoiv, and a slightly wrong-pointing pinky finger from a repelling incident on the ice shelf of New Murmansk that nobody had ever let her forget. She had a titanium pin in her left knee and a recurring dream about a blue-white sun, setting over a salt flat so beautiful it made her chest hurt. She did not have, as of this morning, any idea what had made that sound. She stopped and listened. The forest was quiet in the particular way that wilderness gets when something else in it has also gone quiet. A hush that had texture to it. Weight. The kind of silence that pressed against your eardrums and made the hair on your forearms rise even under 3 layers of gear. Mara pulled her hood back and turned her head slowly, tracking wind. A distant crack of ice somewhere in the canopy, nothing else. She kept moving. The object came into her peripheral vision first, as a shape that didn't belong. Wrong geometry for a fallen branch. Wrong color for a rock. She altered course without consciously deciding to, threading between 2 ancient pines with their snow-laden branches hanging low like tired arms, and came around a boulder into a small clearing where the snow was disturbed in a long, ugly gouge, like something had come down fast and tumbling and finally stopped. It lay in the depression at the far end of the gouge, partially buried. 1 arm extended. Mara stood still for 5 full seconds, then she said, very quietly, "Oh." She'd seen enough survey drones to recognize the chassis. Colonial Freight and Delivery Series 9, a workhorse model, 4 rotors, composite shell rated for temperatures down to -40, payload bay on the underside, beacon array along the dorsal spine. She'd used them herself on the glacial surveys out of Port Calais. They were reliable, boring machines. They went where you sent them and came back, and you didn't think much about them. This one was not reliable or boring. This one had an arrow through it, not a metaphorical arrow, not a piece of debris or a structural failure mimicking the shape of an arrow. An actual arrow, composite shaft, dark fletching that she didn't recognize as any manufacturer she knew. Broadhead sunk deep into the forward rotor housing, where it had chewed through the motor assembly and come out the other side, at an angle that said, whoever, or whatever had fired it, understood exactly where to aim for maximum damage. The shaft was still vibrating very faintly in the wind. A low subaudible tremor. She felt more in her sternum than heard. Mara crouched down in front of it and looked at the beacon array. 2 of the 3 indicator lights were dark. The third was blinking amber, irregular, stuttery, a rhythm that didn't match any standard distress patterns she knew. She pulled off her right glove with her teeth and touched the beacon housing with 2 fingers. It was cold, colder than the air around it, which meant it had been down long enough to lose its internal heat. Hours, maybe longer. The amber light blinked, paused, blinked 3 times fast, paused, blinked once slow. She watched it for a full minute. Then she sat back on her heels and looked at the arrow again and at the tree line beyond, the clearing, and thought about the silence that had followed her down from the ridge. "All right," she said. "Let's see what we've got." She unclipped her pack and opened the survey kit and got to work. The drone's emergency access panel was on the ports of the fuselage, behind a catch that required a specific tool she had in her kit, because of course she did. She'd spent 6 years being the person who was prepared. Things. The panel came off cleanly once she found the leverage point and she peered inside at the diagnostic array with a small headlamp clamped between her teeth. The drive core was intact. The main CPU was intact. The navigation array had taken secondary damage from the impact. She could see where the internal bracing had deformed on landing, but it wasn't destroyed. 2 of the 4 rotors were gone. 1 was damaged. 1 was fully functional. The payload bay was sealed and locked on a separate authorization she didn't have. The beacon array was slave to the CPU, explained the non-standard distress pattern. The machine was alive. Whatever was in that CPU was using the only output channel it had left to talk. She sat back and rubbed her face with both hands and thought about what she was going to do. The rational thing, the safe thing, was to log the find, mark the coordinates, report it through the survey net when she hit the ridge and got a clear line to the nearest relay. That was protocol. That was what she'd been trained to do. You didn't touch down equipment in a field situation without authorization. You documented and you withdrew, and you let the proper people handle it. She looked at the arrow. She thought about who fired arrows. She'd been on 37 planets. She'd walked terrain on 6 of them that had been rated uninhabited and found out various degrees of near lethality. That uninhabited was a word that meant humans hadn't been there, not that nobody had. The Colonial Boundary Commission had a very specific, very careful set of protocols for first contact scenarios, most of which boiled down to do not engage, do not disturb, withdraw, and report. Mara had followed those protocols every single time. She was a professional. She was careful. She had all her fingers and most of her original joints because she was careful. She picked up her pack and her tools, and she looked at the drone for another long moment. Then she started dismantling the broken rotor mount. Took her 2 hours, working with the tools she had, improvising where she didn't have the right piece, herself, through each step in a low murmur the way she'd learned to do on solo surveys. Narrating was a focus technique. A way of keeping the rational part of your brain engaged when anxiety wanted to take the wheel. The temperature dropped 5 degrees while she worked. The light shifted from the flat gray of full overcast to the deeper gray that preceded dark. She didn't stop. She replaced the damaged rotor mount with a jury rig using a brace from her pack frame and some composite wire from her emergency kit, seated the one remaining good rotor, balanced the weight distribution as best she could. She couldn't do anything about the payload bay. She couldn't do anything about the navigation array. But she could do something about the arrow. She examined it more carefully before she pulled it. Composite shaft, yes, but the composite was wrong, not a human manufacture, not a polymer she recognized. The fletching was not feathers, but something that behaved like feathers, dark and veined. Each strand independently mounted on a collar that allowed micro-adjustment, the kind of engineering sophistication that was way past anything you'd find on a hunting arrow from human stock. The broadhead was a 3-blade design, but the geometry of the blades described a curve that no human machinist would choose. Beautiful and strange. For something she didn't have the physics background to fully parse, but that her gut said was not designed for killing deer. She pulled it out in one controlled motion, keeping her hand around the broadhead to minimize torque on the motor housing, and the drone made a sound. A mechanical sound. Not a fan spinning up or a relay clicking. A sound through its speaker array, a single low tone held for 3 seconds, that her hindbrain processed as something between a sigh and a word in a language she didn't know. Mara sat with the arrow in her hand and did not move for a moment. Yeah, she said, I know. Sit tight. She packed the arrow carefully in her sample case and finished the repair work and activated the drone's restart sequence through the emergency panel. The single functional rotor spun up, stopped, spun up again. The beacon array flared. All 3 lights, full amber. Then cycling through a sequence she still didn't recognize. The drone lifted 6 inches off the snow, wobbled badly, compensated, settled into a hover that was labored and asymmetric but functional. It rotated until it was facing her. The speaker array produced another tone. Shorter this time, interrogative, pitched like a question even though it was no language she knew. Don't thank me yet, Mara said. You've got 1 rotor and a bent frame and something out there that shot you down, and probably isn't thrilled that I fixed you. The drone emitted what she could only describe as agreement, a specific harmonic cluster that hit the same emotional register as a nod. She looked at it for a moment. Then she looked at the tree line. Can you navigate? A tone. Uncertain, falling. Can you reach a relay? Different tone. She read it as, not yet, not from here, not with this, okay. She adjusted the straps on her pack and picked up her trekking poles. You stay close and you stay low. I'll get you to the ridge. She set off into the trees, and the drone followed her, hovering at knee height, running quiet. The forest watched them both, with its enormous patient silence. The thing that had shot the drone down was not the only one of its kind. Mara figured this out approximately 40 minutes later, when she found the second set of prints. She'd been tracking the first set for 20 minutes. Long tripodal impressions in the snow, spaced with a stride that suggested something between 7 and 8 feet tall, moving on 3 limbs. The rear limbs set wider and deeper than the 2 forward. The prints were fresh. Whatever made them had been here in the last hour. The second set came in from the east, from a different angle, and converged with the first about 60 meters ahead of her current position. She stopped. The drone stopped behind her, hovering, and she felt rather than heard the slight change in its rotor note. A tension in the harmonics, something that was probably not technically fear, but that she filed under that heading anyway. "How many were there?" she said quietly, "when they hit you?" The speaker array, 4 tones in quick succession. "4," she said, "and there are 2 sets of prints here, so the other 2 are somewhere I can't see." She thought about this. The ridge was 2 kilometers north. The relay was on the ridge. Between here and the ridge was a lot of forest, and at least 4 entities that could shoot a composite arrow through a rotor housing from a distance. She hadn't yet determined. She thought about the arrow in her sample case, about the fletching design, about the way the broadhead geometry implied a physics she didn't recognize. She thought about the 11 years of doing this, the 14 hostile planets, the scar on her jaw, pin in her knee. And she thought about the one rule that had kept her alive through all of it, was not any of the official protocols, but instead the thing her first survey chief, a weathered woman named Doss, who'd seen more first contacts than anyone still living, had told her on her 3rd day in the field. The ones that want you dead don't warn you first. They just act. The ones that warn you first are trying to tell you something. A drone, shot down with a precision weapon, left in the snow. Not destroyed, disabled. A beacon left functional. A payload bay left sealed. Mara pulled off her right glove again and reached into the sample case, and took out the arrow and held it up in the gray light, fletching toward her, studying the micro-adjustment collars on each vein. "They left you alive," she said, "and they left your cargo sealed." The drone produced a sound that she'd been tentatively cataloging as affirmation. "They want someone to find you," she said. "But not just anyone." She thought about that for a moment longer. Then she put the arrow back in the case and her glove back on her hand, and made a decision that she fully understood was probably going to get her court-martialed if it didn't get her killed first. She turned 90 degrees from the direction of the ridge and headed east, toward the denser forest, the place where the 2 sets of prints converged. "Stay close," she said to the drone, "and if I go down, you run for the ridge. Don't stop. Don't come back for me. Understood?" A tone. She read it as argument. That wasn't a request, she said. The tone shifted. Reluctant compliance. She pushed into the trees. The convergence point was a natural clearing about the size of a large room, bowl-shaped where the ground dipped between 2 root masses, and they were already there when she reached the edge of it. All 4 of them, standing in positions that described a rough semicircle around the clearing's center, where the snow was tramped down and marked with something she couldn't read from this distance: sigils. She'd think later, though that word felt insufficient. She'd seen alien life forms before, 14 hostile planets, and a number of others that were merely strange. She'd seen things that made her stomach lurch, and things that made her feel a grief she couldn't source. And one thing, once, on the mail shelf of Proxima Sequentis that she was fairly sure she'd never be able to describe to another human being in any terms that would convey what it actually was. These were tall and 3-limbed, as the prince had suggested, and they had no faces in any arrangement she recognized. What she mentally tagged the head analog was a flat, forward-facing plate of something that might have been chitin or bone, matte gray, smooth, with no visible sensory organs that she could identify. They wore coverings, not clothing exactly, more like structured integuments that wrapped the upper body and the forward limbs, dark, layered, the same non-polymer composite quality as the arrow. Each of them held a weapon, not bows, not physically, Devices that she understood were functionally equivalent, compact and elegant, and terrifying. First one saw her at the same moment she cleared the tree line. They stood looking at each other for what felt like a very long time. Then the nearest one did something with its weapon. A specific movement, a gesture she read, correctly she hoped, as a lowering rather than a raising, and made a sound. Not through a speaker array, through whatever served it as a mouth or a resonating body, or a method of communication she had no framework for. A sequence of tones and subtones and harmonics that were structured enough to be language and alien enough that she got nothing specific from it. Except, and this was the part she'd struggle to explain later, she got the shape of it, the intent. Not the words, nothing so clean as that, but the emotional architecture underneath. It was the same shape as a question. Mara very slowly reached into her sample case and took out the arrow. She held it up, fletching toward them, broad head in her palm. Complete silence from the clearing. Then the one that had spoken made a different sound, shorter, sharper, and the other three shifted. Not threateningly, something else. She felt it in the quality of the silence. The way the air in the clearing changed character, she said, "I fixed your messenger." The drone hummed out from the trees behind her and moved forward until it was beside her, hovering at shoulder height, and made a sequence of sounds she'd never heard it produce before, longer, more complex, a report or an account, something that clearly addressed the beings in the clearing directly in their own tonal system. The nearest one listened, the flat head plate oriented toward the drone with a quality that she read as careful attention. When the drone finished, the being produced a response, longer than anything it had said so far, and slower, and structured differently, and then it turned toward Mara with its head plate and was quiet. "I don't know what you said," Mara said, "but I'm going to assume you're not currently planning to shoot me, because if you were, you'd have done it already." She walked forward into the clearing. It was harder than anything she'd done in 11 years. Her legs knew what her rational brain had decided, but her nervous system was staging a revolt. Every ancient alarm system lighting up red, every instinct screaming at the geometry of four large unknown things with weapons between her and the tree line. She kept walking anyway. One foot, then the next. The way she'd walked through 6 hours of snowfall this morning, the way she'd walked off every ledge and down every crevasse and through every hostile terrain in her working life. You decided to move and you moved, and you didn't let the fear run the math. She stopped 8 feet from the nearest one. She held out the arrow. It looked at her for a moment, or did whatever the headplate did that was looking. And then it extended a forward limb and took the arrow from her hand with a grip that was precise and careful, and nothing like human, and yet somehow communicated, clearly and unmistakably, the same thing a handshake communicates. "My name is Mara Voss," she said. "I'm a geological surveyor for the Colonial Boundary Commission. This is unclaimed territory under commission classification, which means you have the same rights to it I do, which is complicated. I'm not here to argue territorial claims." She paused. "I found your messenger. I fixed it. I'd like to know what it was carrying." Being held the arrow and did nothing for a moment. Then it turned and spoke to the others. A rapid exchange, 3 of them contributing, a debate or a deliberation, or something she had no real word for. She stood still and let it happen and didn't fidget and didn't let her eyes drop from the nearest one, because on every hostile planet and in every difficult survey situation she'd ever been in, the one thing that had always mattered was that you held your position. You didn't shrink. You didn't puff up. You stood in the space you occupied. And you were exactly as large as you were, and you didn't apologize for being there. The deliberation ended. The nearest one turned back to her. It reached with its free limb into the integument layers at its torso and produced a device. Small, flat, dark, the same composite material, and held it out toward her. Mara took it. It was warm. Warmer than the air, warmer than the being's exterior, had felt when it took the arrow, warmer than anything she'd touched since leaving camp this morning. She looked at it. It was smooth on one face and had a subtle raised pattern on the other that she couldn't resolve into meaning, but that felt, under her fingertips, like it was meant to be read. She looked up at the being. It made a sound, then another, then, with a deliberateness that was unmistakable. A slowness and a care that communicated effort, the effort of reaching across a gap. It made a third sound that was not a tone at all, but a phoneme. A syllable, the first syllable of something that was working very hard to sound like a word she would know. She stared at it. "Are you trying to speak standard?" she said. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. The being tried the sound again. 3 syllables this time, halting, shaped wrong in ways she couldn't articulate, but shaped right enough that she caught it. Finally, like a ball thrown badly that you get one hand on. "Boundary, boundary," she repeated. "Commission boundary," a tone. The shape of yes. She looked at the device in her hand. She thought about the payload bay on the drone, locked and sealed. She thought about a delivery drone carrying something important enough to be escorted. 4 of them armed, running a protection detail on a machine, and shot down before it reached its destination, and left in the snow not destroyed but disabled, beacon intact, payload sealed, a message in the disabling itself. Not a kill, a stop, a halt, a hold. She thought about the word the being had worked so hard to say. "You were trying to deliver something to the commission," she said, the headplate oriented toward her. "Held, and someone stopped you." Another tone. "Someone who didn't want the commission to get whatever this is." She held up the device. The being made a sound that the drone immediately and frantically echoed, a sharp harmonic burst that she read, correctly as it turned out, as "put it away. Not here, not in the open." She tucked it inside her jacket, against her chest, and the clearing went quiet. She thought about the geometry of the problem. She thought about the relay on the ridge, and what it meant that these beings had been escorting a drone toward commission territory, and what it meant that something had stopped them, and what it meant that the something was still out there. Because the prints she'd followed here were fresh, which meant whoever had shot the drone down had come back to check on it and found it gone, and was now looking for it. She thought about what Doss had told her all those years ago. The ones that want you dead don't warn you first. She thought about whoever had shot down the drone and whether they'd left the beacon functional. "They left the beacon running," she said. "Not you, someone else." The drone produced a rapid sequence. The being responded. The being looked at her. She'd been set up. The drone had been shot down, and the beacon had been left functional, not as a mercy but as a lure. Something that knew human survey protocols well. Enough to know that a human in this area would find the beacon, would come to investigate, and would lead them straight to whatever these beings were trying to deliver. She was standing in the middle of a trap that she'd walked into. The device inside her jacket was why. She closed her hand around it through the fabric of her jacket and thought very clearly, "Okay, we need to move," she said. "Right now." She didn't know if they understood the words. She thought they might understand the intention. She pointed north, to the ridge, toward the relay, toward the only comms link between this patch of wilderness and the rest of human space. And she started walking. And she didn't look back to see if they followed because she'd decided they would. And that was the only move available to her. Sometimes that's how it works. You commit and you go. They followed, all 4 of them, and the drone, moving through the pines with a silence that made her own footsteps sound like an avalanche by comparison, that long 3-limbed stride-eating distance in a way that made her recalculate their height upward. 8 feet minimum, probably more. The forest watched them. Something else watched them too. She heard it first as a disturbance in the snowfall, a change in the way the flakes were, moving, turbulence from above that wasn't wind. Then a sound, low and sustained, a frequency below speech but above feeling, something that pressed on the inside of her skull and made the fillings in her back teeth buzz faintly. She threw herself sideways without thinking about it. A full combat roll into the root mass of the nearest pine, and the space she'd been standing in erupted in a column of displaced snow and pulverized bark, a strike that left a burned circle in the ground where she'd been, 3 feet across, the snow sublimated clean away. She lay in the root mass and thought, well, that's a directed energy weapon. The 4 beings scattered with a fluidity she didn't have time to admire. The drone cut its rotors and dropped flat to the ground and went dark. She heard impacts, 2, 3, 4, and movement in the canopy above, something repositioning. She pressed herself flat and looked up through the branches. There was a 5th one. She didn't know its species. and she didn't know its relationship to the beings who'd been escorting the drone. And she didn't need to, because she could read posture in any gravity well. And what the thing above her was doing in the canopy of that pine was the posture of something, with a height advantage and a weapon and patience. It wasn't hunting anymore. It was waiting. It had a position, and it was going to hold it and pick off anything that moved. She'd been in this position before, not with aliens and directed energy weapons, with an ice shelf collapse on New Murmansk, and a partner pinned under a collapsed survey rig in one route out that went through the field of debris, and one person to figure out how to move. You did what you could with what you had. She had one bent drone with a jury-rigged rotor, 4 beings with weapons whose effective range she didn't know, 1 sample case, her pack, trekking poles, approximately 400 meters of forest between her and the ridge. She closed her eyes for 3 seconds and thought. Then she took out her trekking poles and disassembled them along the joints, and fitted 2 sections together into a longer shaft, and from her sample case she took the arrow with the strange fletching and the geometry broadhead, and she looked at it for a moment, and she thought about a woman named Doss telling her that the ones who want to talk warn you first. Then she thought, the ones who want to kill you don't. She set the arrow against the assembled pole and thought about vectors and angles and the specific, gorgeous math of a thing thrown through an atmosphere. And she thought about 11 years of field work and 14 hostile planets and a scar on her jaw and a pin in her knee and a recurring dream about a blue-white sun, and she calculated. She had 1 shot. She had no bow. She had a jury-rigged lance and a prayer. She moved, she didn't run. Running was noise, and noise was targeting data. She moved the way she'd learned to move on Proxima Centaurus, which was the planet that had taught her that silence was a tool and invisibility was a skill, and you could make yourself very small or very fast depending on what the situation required. And right now the situation required both at once. She covered 40 meters through the root masses, on her elbows and her belly, dragging the pole lance, not breathing hard, not making the decision to not breathe hard, but simply not. The way you got when everything narrowed down to the next handhold, the next foothold, the next 3 seconds. She came up under the pine from the northeast, the blind side, the direction nothing had moved from yet, and she stood up slow against the trunk, with the pole lance in her right hand, and she looked up through the branches at the shape in the canopy above. It was big, bigger than the ones below. Different profile, more limbs, a different geometry, heavier built. The weapon held in 2 of what she was counting as 4 arms. It was scanning the forest floor in careful arcs. It had not looked down. Mara took a breath. Let it half out. She drew the both pole upward, grabs with everything she had, put her whole body into it, full upward extension that she used to clear ice cores from deep-bore casings. Psst. That specific explosive hip and shoulder movement that generated force out of proportion to apparent effort. And the jury-rig's shaft hit the weapon housing dead on, and the weapon cracked. She heard it crack, something internal fracturing under the impact. And the thing in the tree made a sound and lost its grip and dropped. It hit the snow 8 feet from where she was standing and lay still. Not because she'd killed it. She hadn't. The fall was too short for that. But because it was stunned, disoriented, and because in the 2 seconds it took to recover, the 4 beings who'd been escorting the drone came out of the tree line from 4 different directions and surrounded it, and, whatever passed for a standoff in their cultural context, they were having one. Mara stepped back and let them. She picked up the pole lance and checked the arrow, still intact, remarkably, and stood at the edge of the standoff and let her heart rate come back down from whatever altitude it had reached, and thought very carefully about the next 60 seconds. The thing on the ground produced sounds. The 4 beings produced sounds. The drone crept out of the tree line and hovered at her elbow. Through its speaker array came a tonal sequence that it directed at her specifically, and she read it as, "Stay back." She stayed back. The negotiation took 4 minutes. She didn't understand a word of it. She didn't need to. At the end of it, the thing on the ground made a sound that every body language system she'd ever studied across 17 alien species said was reluctant. Capitulation, and it laid its damaged weapon down in the snow, and the standoff dissolved. The nearest of the escort beings turned to her. She held out the device she'd been carrying inside her jacket. Warm from her body heat, the smooth face and the raised pattern on the other side. The being took it. Then it did something she hadn't seen it do before. It held the device with both forward limbs and oriented the raised pattern toward its head plate and stayed still for 20 seconds with a quality that she would describe later. In the report she filed with the commission, as reading, then it held it back out to her. She looked at it. "For me," she said. The tone of affirmation, she took the device and turned it over. The raised pattern on the back had changed. Not the material of it, not the physical substrate, but the pattern itself had shifted, rearranged. Something that had been locked now unlocked. She couldn't read it yet. She didn't have the framework. But she understood what had just happened. The device was a key that needed two parties to open it. And she was one of them. And whatever was stored on or in it was now accessible to a human reader. She thought about what Doss had told her about the ones who want to talk. She thought about an escort mission, a delivery drone, a payload locked against anything except the right recipient. She thought about whatever organization had shot the drone down and left the beacon active and used human survey protocols as a trap. And she thought about what they were afraid of getting through. And she thought about the fact that fear was a kind of information. "You've been trying to deliver this to the commission for a while," she said. The being that had been working on its standard syllables tried again. 3 sounds, and this time she caught them all, imperfect but unmistakable. Border, warning, map. She stood in the snow in the failing light. 4 aliens and a battered drone around her. A device in her hand that contained something someone had killed to suppress. And she felt the sheet felt in the field when the variable suddenly resolved. Not certainty. She'd never been comfortable with certainty, but that particular clarity of purpose that was its own kind of calm. "Okay," she said. "I know the way to the relay." She started north again, toward the bridge, and this time she didn't look back because she didn't need to. She could hear them behind her. 4 three-limbed beings that didn't sound like anything she knew, and the quiet thrum of a repaired drone staying close, and the particular silence of a forest that had stopped holding its breath. The relay was exactly where she'd left it that morning, bolted to a rock face 200 meters below the ridgeline, a standard commission beacon cluster with a hardened transmitter that she'd serviced 3 weeks ago. She'd left it with a full charge. It still had a full charge. Some things in the universe were reliable. She opened the access panel and jacked in and pulled up the direct line to Commission Station Kessler 7 and put through a call on the emergency channel, which she'd never used in 11 years of field work. And when the duty officer came on, she said, "This is Surveyor Mara Voss, Commission ID 477 Delta 9. I have a first contact situation at coordinates I'm transmitting now. I have 4 individuals of an unregistered species, non-hostile, carrying documentation they've been attempting to deliver to Commission Authority. I also have a 5th individual of a different, possibly related species, detained pending your guidance, and a damaged Series 9 drone. I need a first contact team and I need them fast because I don't know how long the detained situation stays stable." A pause on the line. Then, "Surveyor Voss, please confirm you said first contact." "I said first contact," she said. "I also said fast." She closed the channel and stood at the relay and looked out from the ridgeline across the Kessler Range, the white peaks and the gray sky and the forest below, the endless capacity of a wilderness planet to contain things you didn't know were there. She'd surveyed 300 square kilometers of this range in the past 2 months. She'd missed 4 beings and their adversary. She thought about what else she'd missed. The nearest of the escort beings came to stand beside her at the ridge's edge. It was very tall. The wind pulled at the layered integuments it wore and made them shift. In a way that, from the corner of her eye, almost looked like wings. She stood beside it and let the cold work at her face and thought about what the device in her pocket contained. A map, the being had said. A warning. Border. She thought about the thing that had shot the drone down, and the organization behind it, and the knowledge they'd tried to suppress, and she thought about what it meant that they'd failed. That a hiker with geological survey tools and 11 years of stubbornness and a habit of Narrating herself through problems, had walked out of the snow and patched a wing, and carried a secret up to a ridge. Humans were not, she was aware, the strongest species, not the largest or the fastest or the most technologically sophisticated, not the most ancient or the most multiply-limbed or the most biosensorially capable. These beings beside her could move through a forest without sound in a way she'd never manage. The thing she'd brought down from the tree had weapons she didn't begin to understand. But she'd been on 37 planets. She'd learned something on each of them. And the thing she'd learned that mattered most, the thing DOS had given her that first week, and that she'd been building on ever since, was that the universe was full of walls that someone had decided were permanent. And the stubborn animal fact of a human being was that permanent looked like a challenge. She reached into her jacket and took out the device and turned it over in her hands one more time. A map, a warning, a border. She thought, well, let's see where it leads. First commission shuttle crested the ridge 40 minutes later, running lights blinking against the darkened sky, and Mara Voss stood in the cold and watched it come and felt. For the first time since she'd walked out of camp that morning, something very close to warm. Behind her, the drone's beacon pulsed steady amber. The escort beings stood without moving, patient in the way of things that have waited a long time, and can wait a little longer. The detained ones sat in the snow and said nothing, and the mountain held all of them in its enormous, indifferent embrace. The alien and the human and the machine and the thing between them that someone had tried to bury, and the wind blew and the snow fell and the shuttle came down. Mara didn't know what the map showed. She didn't know what the warning was about, or where the border ran, or what was on the other side of it. She has a fair number of guesses, none of them comfortable. She thought about 37 planets, and the 14th hostile one, and the methane shelf of Proxima Secundus, and the whole blue-white sun in her dream. And she thought about all the places the survey net hadn't reached yet, all the terrain on every classified world that was still blank on the commission charts, all the silences that were actually something else. The shuttle touched down, and the landing ramp deployed, and 4 commission officers in emergency contact gear came down it, and Mara walked toward them with the device in her hand and the arrow in her sample case and said, "I'm going to need to explain some things." And she did, in some calm, methodical way she'd always explained things in the field, narrating herself through the problem, keeping the rational brain engaged. It took 3 hours. It was the beginning of something that would take considerably longer. She didn't know that yet. She knew the ridge and the cold and the relay beacon behind her, and the device that had changed in her hand, opened by the contact of 2 parties, across a gap neither of them had known how to cross until a drone got shot out of the sky in the middle of a snowstorm and landed in the path of someone enough to stop and look. She thought. Later, walking back down from the ridge in the dark, the commission people handling it now. Her part technically done. She thought about the sound the drone had made when she pulled the arrow out. That one low tone, held for 3 seconds. She'd cataloged it as a sigh and then filed it away. See? But walking down through the snow in the last of the evening, she thought about it differently. She thought it might have been something closer to relief. The kind of relief you feel when someone comes along who doesn't know the odds and doesn't care and gets to work anyway. She thought she understood that feeling. She hiked out through the dark with her headlamp making a small warm circle on the snow, and behind her the mountain kept its watch, and ahead of her was the camp, and a heater and a sleeping bag and tomorrow, and whatever came after tomorrow, and whatever came after that, 1 foot, then the next, always the next,